Hello and welcome everyone to a new tutorial about the advanced data apps. And in this tutorial, we will talk about computed writing of data. So what I have here is a very simple form data app. So we got a table item. It's in a base item, of course. We have a text box, which is in that case just connected to our database to a field called monthly payment, and submit is set to on button click, and we got a text label which is actually just showing the current monthly payment. So when I change this here, text label changed accordingly. So that works pretty well. So when I want to submit that immediately to the database, I could simply set it to on value change, so I even don't need a submit button. So when I put 410 in here and I reload, it's set. So let's say we want to set this by a button, or we want to compute the value and write it to the field. So we can do so by picking a button here, and this button we can simply instead of submit, we go to JavaScript code, and then we can access our field monthly payment, and we can set it to a certain value, like say 500. So the button caption, we can put also 500 in. So when we press this button, it will write 500 to the input field, and when we reload, we will see that this is already written to the database. So because, and now this is the key here, we are actually writing into the monthly payment, which is connected to that text box. And that text box is on value change will directly write back to the database. It's very important to know that there has to be a text box which is connecting a certain value from the database with the API. So let me just set the value back to 400. We can reload. It's set to the database. Now let's remove the text box here and press the 500. So it says me that the input element is not found. And this means that to be able to change values in the database, I need to have an input field. So we can't just delete it. We need to have a corresponding text box, which is basically writing that field to the database. So let's say we don't want to see that. That's no problem, because we can simply set it to hidden. And if we press 500 now, it writes 500 to the database, and we don't see that field. Another typical scenario might be that you have a submit as well. So it's maybe multiple values, and we want to change them, and we might have a submit button. So let's put another button in here. Now we go to the input field and say, instead of value change, we go on button click. So now when we, and let's, just for making that a little bit more easy to show, let's add another button here, change the columns. And in that button, let's write 400. And let's write 400 here. So we get two buttons, we can change the value. So when we press on 400, it puts us to 400. But if we reload, of course, it's still set to 500 because we have not submitted it. So we need to press 400, and then we need to press submit, which is of course working, but in some cases you would not like to press two buttons. So you can also go there and actually call the submit automatically. So when we go here, and then we write root.submit, which is actually a function that it's always available on the root. And the same thing we can of course copy to the other script. And when we test this now, we got 400, we can reload, and it has already submitted that. So what happens if we have a validation in place? Validations, just for remember, so let's put this text box to visible here and go to validation, and let's say we need a numeric value here. And the error message should be invalid input, that's fine. So when we go in that field and start writing a letter, it says invalid input, and when we press submit, we are not able to submit this. So what will happen if we press one of our buttons here? They will still work fine because they are validated. So to create an invalid input, we copy that button here and put the value to max, and then we say max here. So let's create, and for the sake of the design, let's put this to column 3. So let's now click on max, and we get immediately the error message that the submit can't happen. That's because our script is calling $root.submit. And we get the invalid input in here. The value is set to the text box, but it can't be submitted to the database. If I press 500, it gets submitted to the database. If I press max again, I get an error. If I reload, we still have the 500 set here. So that's important to know, that the validation script will always be, or any kind of validation will always be triggered even when you set the value of a text field programmatically. And this is just because that's why we have that text box, which actually links our database to the application and determines which values are allowed to write to the database. Another thing you should be aware of is the after change scripts from our text box here. So let's add an after change script. So this is value has changed. We are fine. And when we click a button here, we will get value has changed. This is because setting the monthly payment from a JavaScript code inside the button will also trigger the after change script of the text box or any input item. This is not the case for other scripts. Let's say if you are changing a value inside an after change script, it will not call the after change of that other item, because that would then lead to an infinite loop, which is not desired. So the only script which will trigger the after change scripts is in the button. If you don't want to trigger that, I will show you an alternative way to approach this. Let's just copy the code here, and it's a pretty nice way. So go to the base item. In the base item, we can add JavaScript functions, which we have done before. And these JavaScript functions will not call the on change and after change triggers from the text box. So let's create a new function here and say set value. And what we see here, we get actually values passed to that function. The first is a pointer to the current data context. I will talk about this later when we talk about repeaters and data relations. It's not important right now, but we have to keep in mind that this is always the first parameter. And then we get other parameters which we can use like ever we want. So let's say that in argument 1, in arg1, we expect the value that we want to write to the database. So let's copy our code in here. And instead of 400, we're putting arg1 in here. So now back to the button, we can change the button from JavaScript code to base function, which is actually calling the base function. And it's such an easy way to do that because we can select now set value from the list, and we simply write in the value 400. You also can have script values here. You can combine other database values, whatever you want. So when we go to the next one, let's do this with the next one as well, because it's really a nice way to work with that. And we have the code only once. So 500 here, and this was the one who was setting the wrong code, the wrong value. So put in max. So, and here in the tree, you can easily read what happens. So we calling root set value, and we're passing 400, 500. And in the last case here, we are passing the max value. So when we click on them, the same thing happens. 400, 500, and error, validation message, all that. Which can be tricky, by the way, is if you put the text box to hidden and you still have a validation set, and you press max, even if you don't have a text box, you will at some point have the invalid input here. So that's normally not what you do. If you set a value programmatically, it's a right value. You can actually test that in your function. Let me just show that again. And so that's a way how we work with the with that base functions, and a very easy way from buttons. And as you have realized now, we still have the on change script, the after change script activated here, and it has not been called by our by using our buttons. If we do that manually, then we get value has changed. So it's in each value change we get this, and that's a big difference here. If we click the button, value change has not been fired. That's because it's a base script. Good. So let's remove the value change here. So we learned about manipulating data from a programmatic approach with a function. We could do that either with submit or without submit. We can profit from the validation, which we already have in place. And the really last thing about that, what I want to show you, is one very handy thing, because as you remember, we called submit here in our script. What we can is we can pass the page where we want to go to as a parameter here. So we have to add the .html to it, and this is final page. I think that's the name of the page. So when we save the campaign, if I now press submit here, if I now press 500 here, it sets 500 to the database and brings me directly to the final page. A last thing for the completeness, because when we were using the base function here, and it was calling root set value, and it's passing that parameter. Of course, if you want, you can also put it to JavaScript code and then go to $root set value, and it's already filling in the proper data parameter, which has to be there. And the second argument, we now can actually put our 400 in here, and it will work exactly the same way like before. But this is really not telling you much in the tree, and here you can actually see what happens. So it's a better way to approach that. So thanks very much for listening to how to write computed database values, and talk to you in the next tutorial.